Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most dramatic, paradoxical, and honestly just fascinating stories of modern state building. We're looking at how one man, Lee Kuan Yew, took a tiny, completely resource-starved island and somehow turned it into a global powerhouse. It is an absolute masterclass in ruthless pragmatism. And the crazy thing is, the story kicks off at a moment of just absolute, total disaster.
Picture this. It's August 9th, 1965. Lee Kuan Yew, the leader of Singapore, is sitting there on live national television. He's just gotten the news that his territory has been entirely kicked out of the Malay Muslim Majority Federation of Malaysia. And as he's trying to break this news to his citizens, he physically can't even get the words out. His voice cracks, he stops, and he literally breaks down crying on camera. You see, for Lee, this wasn't just some bad day at the office or a minor political setback. It was sheer devastation.
And this brilliantly illustrates the impossible apocalyptic stakes he was dealing with. Just look at the reality in 1965. Singapore was essentially a slum-ridden, incredibly overcrowded port. We're talking 75% of families living in shacks or squatter huts with zero running water. The island had absolutely no natural resources, no oil, no farmland. 90% of its food and half of its water had to be imported across the causeway from Malaysia. Throw in the fact that over half the population was literate and deadly ethnic riots were literally erupting in the streets. I mean, it looked exactly like a failed state just waiting to collapse.
Section 1. A Nation Born in Tears, August 1965. The immediate aftermath of that television broadcast was unbelievably grim. For 6 solid weeks, Lee Kuan Yew essentially just vanished. He locked himself away inside Changi Cottage. The burden was so heavy, the stress so intense, that he couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep, and doctors actually had to prescribe him tranquilizers just so he could cope, all while the country's parliament just hung in total limbo.
But even in those absolute depths of despair, his cold, calculating rationality started to kick back in. He wrote this incredibly composed message to the British Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, asserting that he and his colleagues were sane, rational people who would weigh every possible consequence before making a move. He was already formulating a survival plan for an island that the rest of the world thought was totally doomed.
Section 2. Securing survival, diplomacy, and defense. Lee took a hard look at the geopolitical chessboard. He's got this tiny port, no army, no food, and these enormously larger, potentially hostile neighbors right on his doorstep. So diplomacy and defense weren't just long-term priorities, they were immediate, life-or-death necessities. He executed this brilliant step-by-step geopolitical survival strategy. First things first, within a month, he pushes Singapore into the United Nations to lock in global recognition. Second, he desperately needed to stabilize things with the Indonesian giant next door. This was incredibly tense because Singapore had just executed 2 Indonesian Marines for bombing a building. In a highly pragmatic and honestly pretty humiliating move, Lee personally flew to Jakarta, bowed, and scattered flowers at the graves of those exact same bombers. Then, by 1967, he co-founds ASEAN to force cooperation with his neighbors, all while he's secretly getting a military initiative off the ground. And that secret military initiative led to a pretty staggering number, 16,000. Knowing the British were pulling out, Lee created national service, mandating that every single young man had to serve. To actually train them, he secretly turned to Israeli advisors. He really admired how they had defended a small nation against much larger neighbors. And it worked. By 1971, through just sheer relentless discipline, he had built a ready-to-go armed force of 16,000 men. Section 3. Economic miracle. Foreign investment. Okay, so the borders are secure. The nation is recognized globally. The next phase was absolutely critical. The economy was completely tanking. To fix it, Lee makes a pivotal move. He brings in a Dutch economist named Albert Winsemius, and together they orchestrate this brutal, highly effective pivot to save the island's finances. Now, what's really interesting about this specific strategy is the exact mechanical nature of it. The blueprint was simple but incredibly rigid. Number 1, completely forget about ideology and nationalism. Just make the island totally irresistible to foreign companies. Keep the taxes low, guarantee absolute stability, and literally scrub the island clean from top to bottom. And it worked like a charm. Giants like Texas Instruments, Hewlett-Packard, and General Electric just flooded in. They even completely reoriented the education system on the spot to churn out the exact engineers and technicians that these massive companies were asking for. As all that foreign money started pouring in, Lee completely transformed daily life.
He took a population where 3/4 were living in slums, dealing with squatter huts and sharing filthy public standpipes, and he just supercharged the Housing Development Board, the HDB. Within a short time, hundreds of thousands of citizens were moved out of the slums and into solid, concrete apartments with reliable running water and electricity. Talk about a night and day difference.
But you're probably wondering, how did he actually pay for all this massive rapid development? Well, that was through the Central Provident Fund, or the CPF. Lee essentially forced workers to deposit roughly 20% of their wages directly into this fund. On paper, sure, it was for retirement. But in reality, it acted as this giant, massive pool of national capital used to build housing and infrastructure. And notice the underlying philosophy here: absolutely zero welfare handouts, no subsidies. Lee firmly, fundamentally believed that every single citizen had to stand entirely on their own 2 feet.
To maintain this highly efficient, fast-moving apparatus, he punished corruption severely. There's this chilling anecdote about his own fiercely loyal Minister for National Development, Ted Chiang-wan. Ted was caught taking $1 million in bribes, and the Anti-Corruption Bureau swooped right in. Before he could even stand trial, Ted committed suicide. Lee's response to the death of his own minister was perfectly cold. He said, "He has done wrong. He has received bribes. I cannot save him." To Lee Kuan Yew, absolutely no one is above the law, because even one exception would bring the whole system crashing down.
Section 4. The Iron Fist, Maintaining Order. Let's move to the next part and see how this builds, because unprecedented economic growth is one thing, right? But Lee maintained that growth and order through some incredibly strict, highly authoritarian methods.
To actually forge this perfectly ordered garden city he envisioned, a deeply draconian set of rules was established. Chewing gum? Famously banned. Littering, spitting, or even jaywalking. Get ready for massive fines of thousands of dollars. The penalty for drug trafficking was literally death by hanging. The press was tightly controlled, heavily censored, and his political opponents, they frequently found themselves completely bankrupted by relentless targeted lawsuits or just detained without a trial.
So the crucial point here is Lee's philosophy on governance, which was just unapologetically blunt. He said, "We decide what is right, never mind what the people think." He really made zero apologies for his authoritarian grip. For him, this wasn't about popularity contests or democratic consensus. It was about figuring out exactly what was necessary for the survival and the prosperity of the state, and then executing it relentlessly.
And, this ruthless approach wasn't just for the locals. It extended to his foreign policy too. Lee bowed to literally no superpower. Get this, in the 1970s, the American CIA actually tried to infiltrate Singapore's intelligence service. When Lee found out, he exposed them publicly, completely humiliated Washington, and slapped the United States with a $100 million fine for espionage. And amazingly, America actually paid it. He had created a nation that demanded and received absolute respect on the global stage. To really understand this intense, almost obsessive need for control and independence, we actually have to rewind to the dark chapters of Lee's past. Back in 1942, he watched the supposedly mighty British Empire completely collapse to the Japanese army in just 70 days. During the brutal Japanese occupation that followed, he narrowly escaped the Sukching massacres by pure luck. He was spared only because a guard happened to be distracted. Those deep wartime traumas taught him one fundamental, unshakable rule: never depend on anyone and never, ever trust chance.
Section 5. The Price of Utopia, Social Engineering. As we enter the final analysis here, it's crucial to understand that Lee didn't just build an economy, he actively attempted to engineer the society itself. And that's exactly what led to a modern Singapore that is as successful as it is highly controversial.
He rolled out some truly extreme social engineering policies to manufacture the demographics and the behavior of the citizens. He implemented strict housing quotas that physically forced Chinese, Malays, and Indians to live side by side to prevent ethnic enclaves. He launched a massive Stop It 2 campaign to artificially cap population growth. He literally banned men with long hair from working in public service. He even openly suggested eugenics policies, actively pushing for educated women to reproduce while encouraging poorer citizens to undergo sterilization.
But when you look at the modern economic data, the sheer financial success of his methods is undeniable. Projections for 2025 show Singapore's GDP per capita hitting a staggering $90,000 per person. To put that in perspective, that's higher than the United States at $85,000 and just absolute leagues beyond neighbors like Malaysia at $12,000. That totally slum-ridden port we talked about in 1965, it transformed into literally one of the wealthiest places on planet Earth.
And it's not just financial wealth either. It's pure intellectual dominance. Remember that wild 1965 statistic about 50% illiteracy? Well, today, Singapore consistently ranks at the very, very top of the global PISA education tests. They are routinely beating out historic heavyweights, countries like Finland, Japan, and South Korea, across math, science, and reading.
So when he was confronted with the heavy cost to personal freedom that all this required, Lee offered this final, unapologetic defense right before his death in 2015. He said, "I am often accused of interfering in people's private lives. Yes, if I had not, we would not be here today." He fully owned it. He admitted to the interference and stated plainly that without it, the prosperous, hyper-secure Singapore of today simply would not exist.
Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. When Lee Kuan Yew died at age 91, almost 2 million Singaporeans stood out in the pouring rain to mourn the man who built their nation. They mourned a dictator, yes, but they mourned a dictator who delivered unparalleled safety, immense wealth, and hope to a place that had none. It really forces us to ask, is the sacrifice of personal freedom worth the price of a flawless utopia? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope this really helped you understand the incredibly complex legacy of Lee Kuan Yew.